Welcome to the Biomedical Frontiers podcast, where we explore pivotal research projects and disruptive innovations aimed at translating scientific advancements into tangible healthcare solutions. I'm your host, Dasha Tishley.
So the question is, how quickly can we build a system that really is oriented and built around expanding health span?
How do you see that transforming healthcare in general?
If we can aggregate that all, and especially with a lot of the accelerations with AIs and stuff we've talked about, then there's significant hope that we can start to understand these processes in enough detail that we can really take major steps towards eliminating a lot of human disease. And you have to be able to deliver information and solutions at scale.
There's a lot of hope in the things that you're saying in terms of not incremental changes, but fundamental shifts to how people approach disease over a longer term. All right, so welcome to Biomedical Frontier, Stories with Innovators in Healthcare. Today we have Dr. Nathan Price, who is the Chief Science Officer of Thorne Health and also the author of a recently published book, The Age of Scientific Wellness: Why Medicine is Predictive, Personalized, Data-Rich, and in your own hands. He has been awarded the 10 Emerging Leaders in Healthcare by the National Academy of Medicine. He's on the board for the Wallace H. Coulter Center for Translational Research at University of Virginia, and he's here to talk to us about some of his research and some of his visions for the future. Thank you, and welcome to the show, Dr. Price.
Well, thank you, Dasha. Wonderful to be with you.
It's a real pleasure. Can you tell us a little bit about what got you into science and what drives you today?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think I became fascinated with the lives of scientists when I was a kid. So one of the big formative elements of my life was that I was taught a lot by my grandmother. So she was a private school educator for many years. Fortunate for us, sadly for her, I guess, her house burned down in California when I was 5 years old. Kind of in an unbelievable quirk of coincidence, she had given a man her letter to pay her insurance, and he didn't do it for a few days. And in the 2 days in between, the house burned down, so she was left kind of without finances. So she moved in with us and ended up just becoming like a real like live-in tutor in a sense, or someone that taught me a lot. And when I was young, I read. I didn't really know any scientists specifically, but I read a lot of the books. And then as I got older, I really got into, like so many of us, Richard Feynman's books, Stephen Hawking's books. And then when I was able to do a summer research internship in college at the University of Washington, all of a sudden it dawned on me, like, scientist is like a profession that you can pursue, actually, and do that. And I got interested in that. And so I started down that path, eventually going to grad school and becoming a professor and building my career.
And how come biomedical research and healthcare-related challenges?
Yeah, I don't have like an amazing origin story about some life-altering thing, but it's just something I was always interested in, and I got the majors. The book of majors. I remember reading through it and I thought. I kind of got to it in a kind of a mundane way. I said, okay, I like science, but I want a job, so engineering. I went through all the engineerings, and I thought chemical engineering was the most sciencey, so I kind of did that. And then I read all the subdisciplines. I was like, biomedical I really like. And so I just started that path and loved it. And so it became an area where the other aspect of that was that I really thought it was an area where there was the future. I really only considered two things seriously, which was either biomedical engineering, which is what I ended up doing, or artificial intelligence was the two things I was really interested in 20 years ago. Turns out both would be pretty great right now.
And now you're doing
And now I'm
both,
a computational biologist. I do a little of both, yeah.
Well, that's fantastic. I also started thinking about with chemical engineering, and then I discovered biomedical engineering later on as I was pursuing my chemical engineering degree, and I had to do like a U-turn because I was like, oh, this is what I actually really enjoy. So did you have any particular mentors early in your career that sort of put you on a path for getting deep into the science versus going out right away into the industry, pursuing a PhD, and how did that evolve?
Yeah, I mean, the two mentors early in my career that were most important. So first was my graduate school mentor, Bernard Paulson, who's at UCSD, really one of the most remarkable people that I know, and someone who takes an incredible interest in his students and trains them and creates a very family-like atmosphere as well. So many dear friends from there, two of whom from the lab are professors here at the University of Virginia now. So Bernard was an incredible guide in terms of not a view of a lab also as a place where you would do science, write papers, but also spin out companies and really kind of create these centers of innovation. That became a big model. And then the second mentor that's been hugely influential in my life is Lee Hood. I did a postdoc with Lee. This was kind of on loan from a faculty job that I had accepted out of grad school at the University of Illinois. But I did a postdoc with Lee, went back to Illinois for 4 years, but then I ended up working kind of as Lee's partner or right-hand man for a number of years, for about 10 years at the Institute for Systems Biology. And so Lee was someone that I had admired and looked up to in science. I was familiar with his history. He's won the National Medal of Science from President Obama. He'd invented automated DNA sequencing, which made the Human Genome Project possible, and many other things. And so I'd really looked up to him. And then when I got to connect, we became really good friends over the years. And we started companies together and ultimately merged lab groups together. We can get to all that. But he really became the most important mentor of my scientific career, I think, easily.
Now, when you talk about systems biology and you're talking about Dr. Hood, and he's, of course, at the foundation of the discipline of systems biology, what did you learn from him, and what have you evolved in your approach to systems biology and the complexity of dealing with these not perfectly defined, difficult to grasp, like human biology systems that are always up for debate and how they actually work?
Yeah, I was just having a discussion around that about how much I think we still don't understand biology. It's a whole topic in and of itself. We've learned a lot. There's a long way to go. So I learned a number of things from Lee. So I think one of the biggest is just a character attribute. And so if you know people that know Lee, probably the two words that you would use to describe him more than any are determined optimism. And so Lee's the kind of person, and I've really absorbed a lot of this, I think, that has an optimistic view of the future and a pretty clear view of where he thinks the future should go. And then kind of a dogged determination, I should say, that to just see it through to the end. And so he doesn't really do no terribly well, likes to get to yes. And if you're a no, then that's okay, because on to the next, right? Until you push and you get that. So I learned a lot about that from Lee. The other thing another thing I really learned from Lee was boldness. So I think especially early in your career, it's easy to be cautious. And what Lee really taught me was to go after really big, bold visions and do so courageously. And I think he's incredibly good at that. And I remember, because we'll get to it, but some of the things that are in the book, the first time I got up on a stage and I said, we're going to launch this project for 100,000 people so that we can predict and prevent, so we can amass data on 100,000 people over 2 decades so we can learn how to predict and prevent all human disease, or something like this, which is a very outlandish statement. I think I amped it up slightly there. But I remember almost choking on that, because it was like a very audacious vision, and yet this was what we were setting out to do, was to try to lay the groundwork for understanding prevention in a much deeper way than possible. And I don't think I would have ever, Lee was definitely a force in getting that whole mission and piece to go forward, which is a lot of what we get in the book. So I could go on and on, but Lee really taught me a lot about, just moving forward boldly on things and not being shy or scared of, if you're going to get criticized. In fact, Lee's only kind of interested if there's some criticism, or people saying there's a problem with what you're pushing, or I don't believe it, or whatever. And he just has been just an incredible mentor and friend throughout all my adult life, pretty much.
So as a chief science officer at Thorne Health, and I want to talk about what that role actually means and what Thorne Health does, but I imagine that you have to shape the vision for the science of the company, where the research goes. Can you talk about what your role entails, what you're doing at Thorne Health, and how that ties into what you're doing with the book?
Yeah, so at Thorne HealthTech, we're really focused on trying to implement scientific wellness at scale. So when Paul Jacobson first reached out to me, well, let me back up slightly. So at the time, I'm professor and associate director of the Institute for Systems Biology. Lee Hood had become chief science officer for the Providence Healthcare Network. So he'd come to me with this idea of merging our lab groups together, which we had done. So we were kind of running this big scientific enterprise, big lab, like $7 million a year in funding, 40 people, one of the largest academic efforts in systems biology. And so Paul came to me and he really loved what we had done in this area of scientific wellness. And he called me up and said, and initially, to see if I might be interested in a job, and I was quite certain I was going to say no. And then he kind of reached out in a way that was interesting, because the first thing he said was, he says, the problem with all you academics? First, I'm like, no, not a one. Why do you bring it up? And maybe it just applies to me, but he says, you want to have your fingers in a million different pies, and you can't see the one huge opportunity that is staring you in the face. And I thought that was a pretty bold, okay, that's an interesting start. But he actually was quite right, because I was about to rail off all the 20 papers and the 12 clinical trials and the 3 companies and all the things that that we were in the process of doing that I couldn't possibly imagine doing. That I couldn't follow up that with. It kind of cut me short on that, because I was about to prove him right and say, look, I'm doing a billion things, which I did also enjoy. And then the second thing he said, which really got me thinking, is he said, look, if you really want all this science and all that you've done to make a real difference in the world, he said, you need to take all of this and piece it together as one thing and make it actually operate in the world, be economically viable, scalable, so that you can actually get this out to millions of people. You've laid out a vision for the future of healthcare and scientific wellness and all the things we'll get into. And that really got me thinking. And so even though I was so happy at ISB, and I had kind of not, and I'd, of course, turned down lots of things in the past and not explored lots of things because I was very happy there, that's what brought me around. So anyway, this little roundabout way to get back to your question, which is, so at Thorne HealthTech then, and working with Paul, it was really taking this company that had it had a history. So Thorne started out primarily focused around making really high quality dietary supplements, natural products, things of this nature, mostly selling to doctors. And so they had grown that so that it was much more to consumers. And at that point in time, I think there were about 3 million consumers and about 40,000 or 35,000 or so doctors that would work with it. Fast forward to now, it's 6 million customers, 50,000 physicians, works with basically every professional sports team in the country through their dietitians and nutritionists that are working with players. And so the idea was that we wanted to expand from that core set out into creating this preventive health company for the future, or what we call a scientific wellness company. So this brings together testing, so microbiome testing, blood testing, really getting lots of data, tying those together with AI, and how do you analyze those data, and then having solutions or things that people can do. And that's where natural products become quite interesting, because if you're talking about trying to do prevention or intervening in or trying to help people that are otherwise healthy, you're really going to do that through lifestyle, diet, and natural products, supplements, things like this, because drugs, for the most part, don't have the safety profile that you would give them into a population. They're really mostly geared for later stage disease. Mm-hmm. So that got into this whole area then with Thorne HealthTech of how do we then create structures that can help to focus on that an extension of your health span in a way that's meaningful.
Yeah, one of the things I really appreciated just going through the website for Thorne Health and looking at the tests was, one, I could order something myself if I wanted to, and I did not need to consult with 3 gatekeepers and then a doctor and have a recipe and all of that. But also the accessibility of the language around things, like there was a lot of things I wasn't familiar with, certain tests I've never heard of, but it seemed that I was going to be able to comprehend it pretty simply with the tools that were given on the website. And that's something kind of rare for medical information in general, other than kind of WebMD type of information databases, is that things that are technical are then translated to the patient directly in an accessible way. Yeah. Now, you mentioned AI as one of the pieces in the back end that's working. Is that some of the things that happen that enable you guys to be able to speak directly to the patient as well and to translate information to them?
Yes. And in fact, that's gotten so much better. I mean, not primarily because of our efforts, but because of the ability of these large language models, right? Your ChatGPT, Bard, all these kind of things that are coming out now. So one of the things looking forward in the AI that we're really excited about is being able to take really deep information that you can gather at the molecular level. We can get into it later, but also the ability to build digital twins, which help you to simulate. I'm sure we'll get into that later. But then to take complexity and make it simple, that's what a lot of these new advances that we have, especially with these large language models, I think is so important, because you can go from even these static tests and static description to really a dialogue back and forth. And this is all happening very rapidly. And so this is an area that I'm just so excited about, because I think it opens up so much knowledge to people that can become accessible in language that you can actually understand. So that transformation is already really underway in a big way.
Where do you see that? Where do you see that being able to reach in the next few years? How do you see that transforming healthcare in general, and from the patient's perspective?
So from the patient's perspective, and I think the pace of this is really going to be driven a lot by regulation and government and sort of what's allowed. It's one of the things I like in the wellness space, because you can move a little bit faster than, say, in the clinical space. But there's so much that's just happening on the level of knowledge or knowledge transfer that can be greatly accelerated now. So if you want to understand, or you have a question, as you build these things out and they're trusted, embedded, and you're able to reduce hallucinations, and that's all getting better pretty rapidly, you can, the ability to just disseminate that at high quality, and especially to places that don't have access to your top doctors at a leading academic medical center, for example. If you're out in a rural community, and we actually work, there's networks of physicians and groups that have been put together to try to make this better. But you can elevate your average doctor to having this super high level of expertise. Now, one example, this hasn't gone through peer review yet, but there was a paper from Google that came out within the last couple of weeks. And what they did is they did 302, I think it was, case studies out of the New England Journal of Medicine, where you were trying to do differential diagnosis. Right? So you're trying to figure out what disease is it out of a related set. And it was interesting because they said, how well could a doctor do on his or her own? And then you looked at, and the accuracy there was something like 33%. You add ability to do Google search or whatever search engine. You do search on top of that, and you're able to get 44%. But you give them access to a large language model, and they were able to get 51%. So you could see this elevation in the ability. Now, what's not pushed so much in the abstract, but you couldn't help but notice, is they also did it where the LLM alone made the differential diagnosis. It got 59%, so it did actually better. So you're already starting to see these. So there's areas that they're going to be better, and there's areas that are going to be worse, and I'm sure, that's definitely true. But you can already imagine that you can have dialogues back and forth. Like if what you're seeking is knowledge, right? You're having a general health problem, right? Let's say not something super significant, but it's significant to you. It's having an impact on your life, right? You don't think you have, cancer or something like that. But if you want to just get access to knowledge, information, something you can act on, things you can try, that's getting better and better all the time. And I think these models really get at allowing the person to get to their precise question faster than the old way of like trying to find an article that meshes as well as you can with what you're looking at. It's just faster, cleaner, and it's just getting better exponentially.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that for me, it's kind of stimulates my thinking on is a lot of the times, pre-AI language model use, being available, the search always starts with information you already know. You already, you put in something and it's sort of like a tree, you can get like maybe 5 or 6 things that you don't know, and then you have to kind of pick randomly from them and then go explore those. And with just using ChatGPT, I can ask it a question. I can say, I only know this piece. Can you tell me what else I need to know? And I'm trying to get over there. And it not only does it do that kind of branching out, but it actually helps me select the next areas of research instead of me kind of at random being like, I think that's the word that sounds like would lead me down a path of further research and then being like, no, that wasn't the thing, backtracking. With ChatGPT, that selection process seems to be a lot faster during research because it kind of narrows down the aperture on, based on your goals, here's the things you might be looking at, even though you don't know what they are.
Yes, and it allows you to have a dialogue with, and you can put privacy, boundaries around all this, but it allows you to, have a dialogue where you're getting into, exactly, here's the health issue that I'm having, and, what could be possible causes. All right, and you can get a set, and you can kind of say, this doesn't look like the right one. You can have another discussion back and forth, but you can provide so much context, and then, and you want to verify things and so forth, but you're able to get into, I do this with myself all the time now, and it's so useful to just, give you ideas of things of, what might you be able to deal with? I'll give an example. So I was having some, suffering, I think, from GERD, like some acid reflux, and trying to figure out what to do about that. And it was one of those things, actually, if you go on a website and you search for that, but I didn't know what I was looking for. You can go to these like large language models, and you can, you can train them up on certain kinds of data, but you can just ask it, and then immediately it gives you like a whole set of things you can do and products. I ended up taking a couple of those. In my case, of course, there are things I got at Thorne, but you could found some of those, made a huge difference for me. And it was just one of those, it's causing me issues. It's not, it's not rising to the level that I'm going to go into my doctor about it, but you can find solutions, especially if you can find something that's, I think that's in the natural space. I love doing those things first, just because they're generally safe, they're good to do. If that works for you, great. And then if not, and you need to go, get medical attention, then you go do that. But it's, I just find them very helpful to navigate just a huge amount of wealth of information that just wouldn't be accessible to everybody.
So I want to turn a little bit, and I do want to go to the digital twins as well, but I want to turn a little bit towards like healthcare system in general. In your book and in previous podcasts I listened to you speak on, you talk a lot about some of the entrenched issues in our healthcare system and how they are deeply rooted in some of the incentive structures of the system, and so unrooting them is very difficult. And this transformation with AI in healthcare, from a patient perspective, I think there's just so many amazing opportunities, but it's also going to create a lot of fear, I think, appropriately, both fear regulatory-wise and like what are people doing, but also fear from a medical profession in terms of like, are we going to be relevant? How are we going to be relevant? Do we have to retrain everybody on everything? And just to kind of illustrate this, a couple months ago, there was a conference here in Charlottesville. It was the Bio Summit, and it was from Seville Bio Summit, and the topic was healthcare AI. And somebody in the audience who was a doctor, raised his hand, and he was like, "You have no idea how much time I have to spend convincing my patients that they don't have whatever they've discovered WebMD on WebMD, and it's like I have to retrain them." And obviously there's an empathy for the patient. Maybe they're waiting for 3 weeks to get that appointment with the doctor, and so every day they're on WebMD trying to self-diagnose. But there is also, a mindset thing there, which is like the patient is going to come in with something, and the doctor's like, "What am I supposed to do with all of this stuff that you've just done?" So how do you think that's going to, how do we approach that so that the technology is there enabling both the doctor and the patient, but also not stifling the possibilities of getting healthcare at home, potentially without having to go to an appointment with a doctor?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of pieces we could get into there. So first thing, I do think that so doctors are going to have to adjust to this for sure. But that's not unique to healthcare or doctors. That's all of us, and we can all see that there's these new capabilities. I am in the optimistic camp in the sense that I think it just changes the nature of the jobs that we do and maybe the scale that you can think about them by having a lot of these tools. And I don't fall into the camp, that I think that AI is going to replace doctors. I like this quip. I didn't come up with it, right? But AI won't replace doctors, but doctors who use AI will replace doctors who don't. That's a common phrase, but I think it's right. So there is going to be pressure to adapt to these things. I am sympathetic certainly to the notion that doctors have to deal with a lot of this. Okay, someone comes in and they've misdiagnosed themselves and they're dead set on it. And I think that's a real phenomenon. I will say, and I don't know what the balance is, there is the counter phenomenon that sometimes, a doctor will only spend a very small fraction of time with you, and you're and you're living your life. So I definitely know of cases that it's gone the other way, sometimes life-saving. But I am definitely sympathetic to that, and that it is an issue. But the cat is out of the bag on that one, I think, in the sense that we're not going to go back to a world where you can't try to find out things about yourself, and that's only going to get stronger. I think as the AIs get better, you should be able to maybe correct some of that in a flow. So I think healthcare organizations are going to embrace a lot of this, and it's going to be part of care that you get access to certain vetted sources of information. They're trained on the right kind of data. I think it's going to be part of your care that you have access to such a system. Now, the benefit of that is that can be integrated back with your doctor, and also that those interactions could become part, if you allow it, right, from privacy, but that could become part of what's informed for health records and things like this. So you could actually become incredibly richer than what you get now from, I think the average interaction is 8 minutes or something like this. And so that's important. The other thing that AIs could really help doctors on, though, and this is one that they, for the most part, really want and really like, is doctors have to spend a lot of time doing chart notes and entering data into EMRs. Universally, they pretty much hate that. And it takes time away from them with the patient. So to the extent that a lot of that can start to be automated now, where you can automate chart notes and they can review them and say yes or error correct or whatever, but you're talking about a much faster process. So there'll be a lot of humanizing of the doctor experience with their patients by taking some of that burden off of them and allowing that to be automated. So that's another piece that I think is really going to be important. But there will no doubt be ripples of change, I think quite rapidly. And medicine typically is one of our slowest moving industries for multiple reasons. One, which is just the safety element because you're dealing with humans, and also and then there's also just a lot of regulatory burden. Some of which I think is, very good for safety, and some of which I think is, probably more harm than good in some cases. That can be hard to measure, and this is a little bit nuanced, and people can like this or not, but it's because when you have a regulator, if something goes wrong with something they approve, they get killed for that, right? I mean, there's huge incentive against that. But if they don't approve something that would have saved a lot of people's lives. That's invisible. So we have this, when we're doing these risk assessments, we are in this situation that we don't see how much are slowing down of medical progress, how many people die because of that. We only see if we move something too quickly, what it does. So one side is much more visible than the other, not necessarily bigger than the other. And so I think that is an issue that we have to deal with because bringing a lot of these types of data together, being able to advance on them quickly. We saw that, with COVID, or there was this like real acceleration for many things, and that got us to vaccines much quicker than we otherwise would have. And we can probably do something like that in a lot of diseases. We just, we don't know. So anyway.
Well, there's two techniques you describe in your book in a lot of depth, which actually have to do with accelerating the speed of getting technologies vetted out for people. So one is digital twins as a way of basically being able to model not just population data, but potentially long-term individualized reactions to things. And then the second one is using a combination of genotyping and phenotyping during observational studies, during clinical trials, in order to more specifically understand, well, if it's not succeeding, is there a reason that we can find among all the people? If it is succeeding, should we at the very least approve it for this specific population if they have these markers? So can you talk a little bit about, let's start with the digital twins, because that's just exciting. It's an area, you guys are doing it in Alzheimer's and dementia research, so that's an area that's been intractable. And there's also some research going on at University of Virginia related to that in the neurosciences department that actually I think is on track to be validating your digital twin model for the oxygenation. So I want to touch on that a little bit. Let's start with the digital twins.
Yes. So first, for people that aren't familiar with this as a concept, a digital twin is basically an in silico or in a computer representation of your biology. And so the idea of the digital twin is that we're going to do a simulation based on measurements from your body about and forecast a health future, and also interventions and how we can change that health future. So the one that we've built out so far at Thorne and working with some great partners of ours is one around brain health, right? Brain health and Alzheimer's disease, as you mentioned. So the first thing when we build these, and this really comes from what the scientific wellness concept as well, but we didn't set out initially to model Alzheimer's. We set out to build a model of how does the brain stay alive? How does it maintain health? So if you want to understand disease, you need to first understand wellness. That's really key. And so we start from that. And so we started building. And so what are some of the things your brain has to do? So one big element is that it consumes 20% of your body's energy, and it's 2% of biomass. So it's 10 times more metabolically active. So it's a huge energy hog. And you have to send energy up there all day, every day. You have to satisfy that constraint. And so we start looking at that. As you go through cognition and through your day, you start building up these lipid droplets, and as they start filling up, you basically have trash that you need to take out. And this is partly what happens when you go to sleep. So when you go to sleep, there are certain metabolic pathways that run in the positive direction to keep this energy, and when they flip, you have to take them offline. So to clear this debris out of your brain. And when you flip, though, you're now taking some of your energy generation offline. And when you do that, we think this is why, for example, that you go to sleep and why all your motor function shuts down, because you don't have excess capacity, and you have to go and you have to do your sleep cycles in a defined order, where you do deep and then REM, because you build up the extracellular ATP, which is an energy currency, in order so that you can then move into the next phase of sleep, so that it has this excess energy as you go into this state where you're taking these, the energy pathways offline. Anyway, there's a whole bunch of stuff to this. So you start building this model of what does the brain have to do just in its normal day-to-day, and there's a whole bunch more, but in interest of time, I won't go through all those. So then once that happens, then what we did is we started layering on known risk factors for Alzheimer's disease. And so So one of the big features that matters, it turns out, is when you start layering onto these fundamental processes is, why do you get Alzheimer's late in life and not early? And one of the reasons we believe for that is that oxygenation into your brain as you get older goes down. And so as you start, you're running these simulations of metabolism and all these elements in the brain, as that oxygen gets lower, it becomes harder and harder to keep satisfying that energy balance. And it's not evenly distributed in your brain. There's certain parts that are harder to get to than others. And then the second big fact that people know about Alzheimer's is there's a gene, ApoE. And if you have ApoE4, you have high risk for Alzheimer's. If you have ApoE2, you have low. ApoE3 is the average for people. And you can have one or two copies of each of those. You have, any combination of two of those alleles. So what happens then is that when we run these simulations, one of the things you find is if you want to keep energy generation in neurons high, you have to keep cholesterol levels in these supporting cells called astrocytes low. We'll get into all the details of how those things are coupled. But basically what we're able to show is that ApoE4, it's known that it has a role in this transport of cholesterol out of the cells, but it's slow. So that concentration stays high. And ApoE2 does it fast. If all you do is take those two facts, this measured lowering of oxygenation as you get older, and this difference in the efficiency of keeping energy generation high, it predicts the age of onset of Alzheimer's disease for all the different genotypes, whether you're ApoE4/4 or 3/4 or 2/4 or 2/3 or whatever. And so that's one of the things we were able to show in the digital twin model. There's many, many things we could talk about. Another, though, that I'll just point out is the conventional wisdom around Alzheimer's. And I gave one of the opening plenary session talks at an NIH meeting on Alzheimer's disease last week. So we got into this with, there's differing opinions amongst experts. But the conventional view has been that Alzheimer's is caused by amyloid plaques. And that's been the view for a long time. It's been under fire recently. In the conception as we put this together, we really have quite a different view of that, in that one of the things that happens is that as your ability to keep positive energy balance or keep your neurons alive, as they start to die, you start to lose neurons and synapses. And as those die, then the firing in your brain starts to go below a certain threshold, and you're no longer able to do what's called Hebbian learning. This is the what fires together, wires together paradigm. And as that happens, you have to secrete a molecule to signal to the brain that you are to recruit additional synapses. And what is that molecule? Amyloid beta. So amyloid, rather than being primarily the cause of Alzheimer's, is actually part of a compensatory mechanism of the brain trying to save itself from this underlying defect. And so there's some nuances to that, but if you take that as a dominant paradigm, it really changes the view of, have we really been lost by attacking something that is not really centrally causal to Alzheimer's disease for decades, because we have failed to understand what the disease is really about. And so building this model has really just shifted my view quite strongly, the digital twin simulations. And then the other thing I'd say about the digital twin simulations is that, we've been able to compare them against quite a lot of data now, and they give you this incredible capability of taking in measurements from blood and genome about you, and then predicting the likely age of onset of dementia, with a probability map. It's all, it's probabilistic. But then it can say, all kinds of interventions, which we can get into in a minute, about what are the kind of things that you can do to stave that off or push it into the future. And then you can re-simulate that so that you can see the benefits. So anyway, these things I think have been, for me, incredibly eye-opening. And we're really excited to build it, not only for brain health, but to just move across as many different health conditions as possible as we go forward.
What are some of the medical conditions where, like Alzheimer's, they have that debate right now? Do we have the right model? Are we actually treating the cause or the symptom? Is the treatment that we are administering actually fixing anything, or just sort of working for some other reason that we can't figure out, or maybe not even working per se, but just staving it off or pushing problems into a different. Is there like a priority list of most complex or?
That's actually a great question. No one's ever asked me that one before. That's interesting. Yeah, Alzheimer's jumped up so much to me just because it has been this really controversial area. I think any of these diseases, though, where we've really tried hard and we just haven't made much progress, is really a clue that, that we may not really understand it fully. I think some of the other neurological diseases would certainly, pop up in that regard, that there's probably a lot more that we could, understand that we're not, treating as well as maybe we could. Parkinson's, things like that.
Schizophrenia,
that would be a really good one. Those psychiatric disorders are really tough to deal with. There's been, in some of these cases too, I think another really interesting aspect here is how much, certainly in Alzheimer's, like drugs have really not worked for us very well. Lifestyle intervention, though, has worked quite well. So there's a big famous study in the field called the Finger Study. There's a follow-on in the U.S. called Pointer, which is going to release results soon, that show like quite meaningful. So, you're measuring effects in years as opposed to, slight decline of delay for a period of months, like you see with the drugs so far. And in fact, a really interesting talk that was at this meeting that I went to last week, focused on a lot of these. And in fact, some of these analyses show that, particularly in certain populations, the Latino population was particularly strong, that something like 56% of Alzheimer's is believed to be preventable through lifestyle. And it varies like community by community. That was the most responsive. But anywhere between 20 to 50, upwards of 50% is thought to be preventable through lifestyle. So there's a huge space that we can act on if we do things under a scientific wellness paradigm where we're thinking more about prevention than late stage disease. And Alzheimer's is particularly an interesting case for that, because once a bunch of your neurons and synapses have died, it's really hard to imagine, a small molecule, drug is going to somehow recover from that. You get some benefit, but it's really hard to imagine. Whereas the whole process of just not letting your neurons die in the first place is much simpler, much easier. Of course, that's not saying anything that, we haven't been, at least at a high level, aware of for a long time. It's basically the story of Humpty Dumpty. So, easier to not break the egg than it is to put the egg back together. Same with your brain. So that's one of the reasons that I was so motivated in this notion of scientific wellness as we define it, or preventive health, or precision health, or however you want to call it. But basically is the notion, like, we need to not wait so late in intervening in disease. It's coming in much earlier, understanding what those earliest factors are, and then what can you do to ameliorate that, right? How do you keep your neurons from dying in the first place, or whatever disease scenario you're looking at, so that you can extend that health span out?
So do you see this research with the digital twins, the kind of insights that it's providing, that it's opening up additional new ideas for treatments that might be possible, or if not so much to obviously regenerate the things that have been damaged in the brain, but at the very least to have like a dead stop, or, what's sort of the gamut of possibilities that this might open up in terms of treatment modes? Yeah,
so one of the things that I think it really highlights is how important combination therapies are. And this was actually the subject of this NIH meeting that I mentioned. So one of the things that's really fascinating, so when we run the digital twin simulations, we've focused primarily on lifestyle and supplements and things like that for prevention. We can do drugs as well, and I can maybe talk about that in a minute. But what we'll look at is that for most people, if you look at individual measures, we would predict that any one of them by themselves would not really do very much. And you can imagine this by way of analogy like a clock, right? You have a clock that has 3 gears to it, and all 3 of them are broken. If you take the broken one out and put in a good one and say, does that matter? You'll find out the clock doesn't work. Right? You put the broken one back in, you try the next one, you put in the good one. It, of course, doesn't work. You have to put all the gears have to work for it to work. And the brain is very, very similar. And so one of the things that it really points towards is how often, if you're looking at a single intervention, almost everybody would be predicted to be a non-responder. But when you start doing combinations, like these personalized combinations, the digital twins would tell us that most people become responders. So we can literally see people that for single interventions, they do nothing, and you start putting them together and they get 10 years. And so of extra, healthy years of brain life. So that I find really impactful. So one of the things it's changing for me, and I'm really evangelizing a lot about this in the scientific communities, not only at the NIH, but at the national, I talked about this at the national academies. I've talked about it with, groups at a scientific group at MIT and Johns Hopkins, and anyway, a whole bunch of different groups like this. But basically is the notion that the way that we do preventive clinical trials, I think, is deeply flawed in general. And the reason for that is that when we focus on this single intervention, and I would say especially things that are in the natural product space, just because they're not going to hit as hard as a drug, but when we take these single interventions, you run them for these short periods of clinical trials, and a lot of the time they fail. And some of the time it's because they don't work and whatnot. But I think we're actually throwing away a lot of valuable elements. So an example of this is in observational data, people were looking at vitamin D, right? Very common vitamin. And people that had low vitamin D were 4 times as likely in this study to get Alzheimer's disease as those who had high vitamin D. Because that's a big observational effect. But there have been a number of randomized controlled trials with vitamin D and where it didn't work. And so the conclusion is, the typical conclusion would be correlation, not causation, spurious. And that could be true, right? Could be true. But when we take the digital twins, one of the things it lets us do is actually simulate those clinical trials exactly. And so we can take the exact age of the people that came into the trial, how long they were followed up, all those pieces, and then we simulate them in the digital twin under the assumption that vitamin D is 100% causal. We know the causal mechanism, so we've put that in there. And it has exactly the strength size that has been observed in the observational study. So you can make that as like a complex hypothesis. And we rerun the trials that have been done, which are small, short duration, and so forth. And when we do that, what we find is that the expectation, if vitamin D is 100% causal at the level that it appears to, if it was 100% causal and had the effect size it appears to be, that none of those clinical trials would be expected to have a result. They're not at a period of time in life. They're too short. You wouldn't expect to see it. And so the big thing that I'm pushing on now is we shouldn't set up prevention trials like this around a compound where most people don't respond, and we can only afford to do it for a short period of time. Instead, what we want to do is run randomized clinical trials on the digital twin, which represents underlying it as a complex physiological model. It's a complex hypothesis of how that disease operates as a whole. And then you take individual data, and then you have personalized interventions for every individual. So every individual is getting something different, some different combination. But what you're testing is not the compound. You're actually testing the model, the digital twin itself. And so my belief is that that's going to lead to much more efficacious trials. And when we run simulations, the effect sizes are radically higher when we do these combinations. And so, we're trying to set that up now for a clinical trial so we can, prove that out going forward.
So that sounds like that might radically shift both the way that we do research at the early stages of developing treatments, but also in terms of how we might actually do clinical trials instead of designing it, let's say in our minds and running it, and then running a different one, and then running a different one. We might run 1,000 different trials in a digital environment and kind of get, if this was true, these would be the ways you'd actually structure the trial so as to ascertain and have the digital output actually then inform the trial you actually run, and then compare that to what happened virtually to see if your hypothesis was right.
Exactly right. So, and that is one of the cool things when you have these, this kind of deep simulator of what you believe is happening in a disease, is that you can forecast the clinical trial in advance. And it doesn't represent all the biology, right? I'll just give the caveats, because you can be surprised in trials, but you would never be able to do all those counterfactuals or run all of those trials in the real world, because it just takes too long. So what you can do then is you can come up with designs for trials where you expect the magnitude of the effect to be visible. You can say over what period of time, and you can ask questions. We've been doing this in the design of clinical trials for Alzheimer's. Do we want to recruit people in their 70s who are ApoE33s? Do we want to have a diversity of genetic background? Do we want ApoE44 people in their 70s? What's the difference between recruiting people that are symptomatic versus not symptomatic? Anyway, there's all kinds of variables you can go through, and you can simulate it in advance of where would you expect to see a signal, and it saves you a lot of time and money.
So what's required? Like, let's say we take University of Virginia, since we're doing this podcast,
yes,
talking about translational research. What would it be required to bring this type of technology to an entire team or department of researchers, so that every clinical trial goes through this kind of vetting process? Do we need a data science department inside every research team? Like, what's the infrastructure, the specialization needed to bring this type of technology to bear?
You could certainly do this on a contract basis, or have like a centralized repository, being able to build out something like a digital twin capability. They definitely need to be built out, more and more for more and more conditions, more and more cases. It wouldn't have to sit inside every research group. I think it could be a centralized, place that you go to. Certainly with the brain health model and, what we have at Thorne, we'd be, happy to work with groups that, that were interested in this. We'd just have brain health for now, but, we'll be expanding. Or groups, or universities could, say, okay, we want to really build this out in a bigger way and have a center for it. And, and other groups could come in and do it. But I am a very big believer in this notion that, especially if we want to put a layer underneath precision medicine or personalized medicine that's strong evidence-based, I think we get there much better by focusing on the trial is about the model, which again is a complex hypothesis about exactly what you think fuels the whole disease. It can have many, many facets to it. And every person that comes through the trial is getting something different. It is particularly useful, I think, for preventive trials, especially if you're focused in like lifestyle and natural products and so forth, just because you can mix and match much more easily. You can do it for drug trials and combinations as well. There you have to be a little more cautious, a lot more cautious, because of unexpected drug interactions. So you have to have a really good handle over what those look like. So that gets, that's a bigger safety issue, but still doable, still doable. And so I just love this notion, though, of switching that paradigm. So it's not always the single molecule. I think when new drugs are introduced, they're still going to for the most part, be single molecule. But once you start talking about how do we use these things in combinations and personalize, that's where you really get into the digital twin space.
Well, another thing you've mentioned in your book that's also transforming the way research is done, and now more specifically to clinical interventions that include drugs, not prevention, you talk about phenotyping and genotyping and tracking the evolution of that in a population that you're doing clinical trial in. And you mentioned two studies, and I want to see if we can get into both. One is the breast cancer study, where a drug was approved based on being able to clearly see what population of people was benefiting right away. And just as a clear marker of this study didn't even need to go through all of the sizes of people recruited in order to ascertain its efficacy. But the second is the COVID study that you guys did during COVID that actually, on a small population of people, was able to give a lot of information about all of the risk factors. So let's dive into those.
Yeah, that sounds great. So the first trial that you're alluding to in the book, I believe, is a very famous trial. It's one of the most famous trials in personalized medicine. I had nothing to do with it, but it is a great example. And that is the use, this is around Herceptin and this genetic variant HER2/neu. And what it was found was that if you had this particular genetic variant, the treatment would be very efficacious for you. And if you didn't, it wouldn't. This was one of the real pillars for, what has become precision medicine. And that trial was, as you stated, ended early because it was becoming obvious that it was so successful that it was considered inhumane to keep putting people onto the control group. So that was a really stellar example. So before going into COVID, maybe I'll stop and just say a few words about what you brought up on genome and longitudinal phenotyping. So this was one of the things that Lee Hood and I really got into a lot, especially when we'd co-founded this earlier company now out of business called Aravale. But basically getting genomics on everybody, which is a good baseline for understanding your health and how your body operates, a baseline. And then when we say longitudinal phenomics, which is a word that's not going to be familiar to most people, what we mean are basically deep measurements that are changing dynamically in your body. So this could be metabolomics data, so all the small molecules that are circulating in your blood, proteomics, these proteins, again, we pull them, they're circulating from the blood. We did about 100 to 150 clinical lab measures, so this is the kind of thing your doctor might do, your hemoglobin A1C, your your fasted glucose, your liver enzymes, and so forth. Microbiome, which we do from stool, and wearable devices, so you get access to information. And so you can put all this together and start to build what we call personal dense dynamic data clouds, which is another big word, or longitudinal deep phenotyping. But basically, it's just the notion that you're measuring now thousands of things out of the blood or across your body dynamically that you're monitoring for your health, that kind of the genome brought to life in a sense, so you can see it in action. So we have applied this also to disease trials, as you mentioned. So COVID was one of those. This was really led by Jim Heath, who is the president of ISB. I was peripherally involved, but Jim was really the driver. But the idea here at the beginnings of COVID was to try to take this same approach and look at these dense data clouds as they emerged in COVID. And so one of the things that really came up was, what were the kind of things that would lead to people that would transition to, say, long COVID versus not. And so we just had these reports from people that were coming back on that, and we did an analysis. And so that was able to get into a few different areas that popped up. One was the presence or kind of emergence of Epstein-Barr virus was a big element of that. Whether people were pre-diabetic or diabetic, and those markers kind of jumping in these data clouds, like that was a big piece of it. When we looked at mild versus moderate COVID, another thing that really popped up was that when you went into moderate or severe COVID, there was this major depletion of amino acids out of your blood that we weren't necessarily expecting. Presumably, a lot of that, though, was to fuel maybe immune responses, but if you run out, then is that causing a problem? And a lot of those kind of things. But the general notion here is that we believe that you can, basically for any sort of disease clinical trial, and it's the same kind of thing as what we've done in Alzheimer's or in diabetes, but basically you can add on to any such trial the genome, which is really essential for understanding the basic building blocks, but then this longitudinal phenotyping. And what it lets you get at is not only looking at the primary endpoint of, am I having an impact on the disease, but it gives you this huge wealth of information to follow up on about, well, what actually happened in each person. And then we talk about this as not aggregate, as not just analyzing like averages, but you want to look at what we call aggregated N of ones. But basically, you're looking at every trajectory in a lot of detail, and then you're looking for patterns amongst those trajectories. So just a little bit different way of thinking about these trials.
Is this something that you're seeing already taking root in the scientific community, or is this so novel and it needs to be kind of evangelized? What's the status of using these techniques in conjunction?
Oh, it's definitely been building out. So when we first started, some of the really, there were a few people that had done this individually on themselves. Most notably, Mike Snyder, chairman of genetics at Stanford, did this. The Snyderome, so he measured all these things on himself. Eric Alm did a big year-long effort on monitoring his microbiome on a daily basis. Larry Smarr at San Diego had become one of the most deeply phenotyped human beings, and he has this, actually, when I was out visiting him in San Diego some years ago, he has this like two-story high, I don't know, like 50, 60 foot long, like monitors that he has with all of his personal data on it. It's this huge projection screens that they've got in the San Diego Supercomputing Center. Very cool. And he has a 3D printed version of his diseased colon that he'll hand around when he does talks. So it's very interesting. Anyway, so there were like these N of one that were out there. Then when Lee and I started the Pioneer 100, which was in 2013, which is our first big effort, this was the first kind of larger cohort where we generated these longitudinal data sets. And then since then, there's been a lot more. So Mike Snyder certainly built a ton around this at Stanford. They're bigger efforts. Some of this is the All of Us program at the NIH started with just genomics, but they're adding like more of this longitudinal phenotyping in pieces. Same around the UK Biobank, these like really large efforts. So you're seeing more of that. There's been a number of larger NIH efforts. So it's getting there. And then at Thorne, what we're really trying to focus on is making it really accessible for people to first get valuable health information out of this, and also make the collection easier. So for microbiome, like we're capturing microbiome data. We invented something called a microbiome wipe, which is what it sounds like, basically. Well, just slight detour. So not that many people have done their microbiome, and I think it gives a lot of valuable health information. And it's just gotten more and more valuable. Like the amount we can say today versus 5 years ago is light years ahead. 5 years from now, it'll be light years ahead from where it is now. But most people don't want to do it, and part of that is like if you want to measure. I don't know if you've done a microbiome
I don't know if
test
I have.
on yourself.
I don't know.
So maybe I shouldn't have asked that because now it makes it more personal. Anyway, let's keep this generic. And
next time I'll come in with the results. We can go through them.
Yes. But what do you have to do? Like you have to poop into a bucket or on a piece of paper or something. You got to take a little scoop, put it in a vial, close it. Some of the tests require freezing. I don't know what you keep in your freezer. I imagine probably samples, but some people it's food and they don't particularly like it. Anyway, there's all these barriers to doing it. So one of the things we developed at Thorne was to develop something we call the microbiome wipe, so that you can wipe like you do every day. Then you can drop it into a vial, close it, shake it. Then 10 seconds, it dissolves away. You can push another button, release the salt solution. And we showed in a paper in Frontiers in Immunology that you could get as high quality sequencing data off of this. And so anyway, all that to say that it makes it simpler to do the test. We got a nice anecdote from that. Sarah Gottfried, who's a real well-known physician, #1 New York Times bestselling author. Anyway, when she was on the Huberman Lab podcast, she shared that they would never do the microbiome test the old way, but when she switched to the wipes, like they would do it. And so this was with an MBA team she was working with. So that was exciting. And then we've also developed this virtually painless at-home blood collection device called the NanoDrop. Anyway, I don't want to get too far into that, but the reason that I went down that road is that as we start trying to build up all these big data sets, you got to start thinking about how do you get this data easier? How do you make the user experience better? Because if millions of people start doing this and you can capture, that kind of information, that really helps accelerate the degree to which we can learn from that and build out better solutions for people. So it's happening in both the academic realm and the industry realm, and there are big governments around the world that are really into this as well. Like the UK, a lot in the Middle East now is getting into this a lot too.
Well, speaking of the data, which I think is so important, the patient immediately has a million concerns. One, of course, is going to be security. The second one is processing, which we talked a little bit about the impact of AI on that. Mm-hmm. But the other one is also so security, data ownership, but also right now, the patient experience is I go to this doctor, the data's over there. This doctor gives me a CD. I don't even know how to play a CD or what I'm supposed to do with it.
Right.
You just have this
what's that?
It's all over the place, and you don't always have access to it in an easy method to aggregate and use. What is this going to? Is there solutions on the way for this, or is this something that we kind of don't have any feasible solution that's ubiquitously applied for actually making sure your data is secure and available to you easily and aggregated?
I think some of those things are pretty well in hand and some aren't. In terms of security, data privacy, things of that nature, there are occasional breaches, but for the most part, that's taken very seriously. Data is de-identified. And if it's in an organization that needs to know identifiability, then that, it's all covered by HIPAA laws. And there are very strict penalties for breaking those. So as companies and researchers, by and large, especially if you're doing research analysis on data, do not want to know who people are. And it's actually immaterial to kind of the goals. If it's in a group that's obviously, if they're providing healthcare to you or something that is, where that identity is necessary, keeping that information private and secure is, it's not perfect, but it's taken incredibly seriously, and penalties are big. So I think that issue is in pretty good shape. There are cases where it gets more and more challenging. Genomic information, by itself is identifiable, but at least today, to identify someone from just a genome would still be a lot of effort, and it's a lot of effort that creates legal jeopardy for you and no benefit. So it's a question. You could argue that a little bit, that maybe there's a benefit if you're an insurance company or something like that, but even still, the risk if you were caught doing that would be high. Other things that you mentioned, though, I think are much more nascent. So if you say, the aggregation of your own personal health data in a way that you can actually use. This is the one I would be more frustrated with myself. That's very fragmented because you switch healthcare systems, and so I switched to a new healthcare provider recently, a new doctor. She's great. I really like her. But I have blood measures. Well, I've gotten my blood measured many times from different companies. It's not all in an aggregated source, right? I'd love to have that. It's one of the reasons I like some of these, wellness companies, because you can actually track your data over time in a nice dashboard and understand what trends are and how, you just get such a better sense of where your health is at when you can see these things. Now, some of this is getting better. Apple Health, for example, I think, and they may be, in a lot of cases, the default aggregator, and I use Apple, so that's the one I know the best. There's also, there is a similar group that's on Android phones, and which is in the book, and I'm blanking, the name starts with a C, I should come to be in a second. So there are these groups, but so let's take Apple Health. They're making it a lot easier for you to opt in, right? So all your wearable device goes there. But there are also all these companies that are getting so that they can grab your electronic health record data. Just realizing I met the CEO of one of these companies recently that was going to do a demo for me. I'm going to have them do that because actually maybe they could aggregate this, and then next time I'm on, I will on something like this. I will give them a nice shout out if that works. But there are all these companies that are coming up where they can pull EHR data across the system. So those things I think are getting better, but it's there's a long way to go. And those things are slightly at odds with each other because the more data you aggregate, it does create more risk around privacy. And people do fall into different camps. Like I'm in the camp, like literally if almost any company says we want access to your health information because we want to integrate it and give you health advice, like I'm just yes. Like I love that stuff, and I don't know if I'm in the big wing or the small wing. I know I have friends that are exactly the opposite, right? They're like, don't let anyone know anything about you ever. But for me, for health, I really like pulling that information together. So I'm supportive of that. And one other note I'll make is, there's a diversity of views. So everyone should have the right to control how their data is used and what they're comfortable with. So consent is absolutely essential. So you can have people like myself that really just want to share it because I just want to see it advance, versus people that just say, no, I have a sensitive issue, or I just don't like it and I don't want to share anything. I think those things have all got to exist. The aspect that I like in terms of the sharing of a lot of this, though, is very often you run into these, I don't know what to call it, like opposing forces, right, that are pulling. And one piece is if we don't deeply aggregate health information such that we can take a lot of these dense molecular data and understand how it relates to health outcomes, which means do people that have this signature, do they get diabetes, do they get cancers, do they and starting to and aggregate that across like decades of life so we can see the movie, right, rather than just a snapshot. If we don't aggregate data in that way, we will never solve disease in a serious way. And then we will keep dying from a lot of the same things that we die from. We'll make incremental progress like we mostly do. But if we can aggregate that all, and especially with a lot of the accelerations with AIs and stuff we've talked about, then there's significant hope that we can start to understand these processes in enough detail that we can really, take major steps towards eliminating a lot of human diseases, which is what I would love to see us get to. Now, there's the flip side, and then there's the flip side. The pull against that is, well, can you have data out there without, privacy or hurting each other? But one of those is a physical, just reality of nature, which is that if you don't put the data together and analyze, you can never know. Mm-hmm. And the other is sociological, which is, can we not screw each other over as we do that? And I feel like we should be able to figure out a way to make that operate in a society. And so I see that happen all the time where there's, things that I see as like a biological or physical reality of like, this is how that has to happen versus something sociological. So my hope is that, and smarter people than me on that side will be working on this, but, I'd like to believe we can get to that future and make the benefits, broadly available and the downside. And I'd like to see us get rid of those downsides, not by forbidding the aggregation of information that is essential for us to solve human diseases. And I think having constraints on the use of that data is really important. So I'd rather not stop it from happening, but stop, severe penalties and for misuse of that data, things you're not allowed to do.
Well, I think some of the things that you mentioned, for example, the use of that longitudinal phenotyping data in being able to early detect changes that might be indicators of very early stages of some of the deadliest diseases like cancers, diabetes, Alzheimer's, but also general monitoring of health, even seeing whether treatments or preventative measures are impacting your general health metrics. I think for many people, the concept that it had to be manual and you would aggregate it and somehow you'd get some information, or that a doctor might look at it, it was very vague and very distant. But now I see the incentives really changing because we now have a methodology for something, not a human being with a piece of paper and a pen, pulling this together and making sense of it. And so every one of those blood tests done, for whatever other reason, is now something that's like a clue to the puzzle of your health over the long term. And before it was like, okay, it's the one-time test. Why would I keep it? Almost like now it actually is like, that's like a treasure trove of data about how your health has evolved over time.
Yeah, one of the factors that makes a difference in the forecasting of Alzheimer's disease are things that happen for women during menopause, for example. And so I'm just using that as an example, right? Those things are separated in time. We've actually been involved in papers that showed that, adult diabetes, is partially predictable by things that happen in childhood, different measures. And, you can use measures that are 20 years earlier and they happen, and they're predictive to some degree of things that are happening way, way later. So there is a lot that can be pulled together that transmits across time. Another factor that's helped us learn more about disease is that if you study people who are asymptomatic, right, so who don't have any particular disease. So when we started the Pioneer 100 and then the Aravale cohort, we got lots of people that told us that this was a complete waste of time, sometimes very vehemently so, which always confused me because I'm like, look, if it's, I'm wasting my life, not yours, so I'm not sure why you care. But anyway, it's I can see why I care. It's good. Thank you for the advice. But, and the reason for that was that if you don't have a case control, right, a disease, and we've used those in many contexts. But one of the things that is really interesting is when you do a case control analysis like cancer versus normal, you see hundreds or thousands of differences in either gene expression or proteins or metabolite changes and so forth. And it's a big complicated mess because you're trying to sort out what's causal, what is a cascade or a downstream, just consequence of those underlying causes, and what's a compensatory mechanism. I already argued in Alzheimer's that I think we were wrong about amyloid, which set us down, many hundreds of billions, some estimates as much as $1 trillion wasted on that as a therapeutic target as a whole. Anyway, so we have that. But when you look really early in asymptomatic people, and the way you get at this is through the genome. So the genome, you can develop a risk score for any particular trait. And so I don't know that these people are going to get the disease or not, but I do know that bucket A is going to get the disease at a higher rate than bucket B or C or D because I've stratified them by genetic risk. And you can look for what's different in those individuals 20 years before they got before this disease would be, expected to emerge. And what you find is that there are differences that are manifested in the blood in these dense data clouds in this longitudinal data that are different as a function of differential risk for disease. And the interesting thing there is how much is that they're very sparse. So there's not much to look at. There's just a few things. And what it looks like to me is that there's quite a lot of enrichment for things that are causal, that are good targets. So when we applied this to the hundreds of proteins we measured for a risk for coronary artery disease, there was only one protein that was highly differential across genetic risk, was PCSK9. Well, anti-PCSK9 has been developed as it's the biggest new breakthrough drug in that space over the last 10 years. Asthma, there was, again, only one protein. And there's 4 drug companies that have that in late-stage clinical trials as a therapeutic target. Anyway, I could go on about these, but it gets you into a very different state when you're studying people at these, so in other words, you're looking at data that's way, way before, right? We'd never deal something for them clinically. But my argument is that we actually, by looking at the movie, by seeing what happens first and then later and having that, is that we actually get a much deeper view of what is cause, consequence, compensatory mechanism. And if we only do late-stage disease studies, it's all mixed up. It's all together. And it can be very, very hard to figure out what's what. And I know that because I've spent 10 years doing that. So I've been in the same boat as everybody else.
I mean, I think the news is super encouraging, right? It's like, I think a lot of people are frustrated with health care right now. It definitely feels like sick care, and sometimes it just feels like sick treatment, the care, sometimes there, sometimes not. And, we all know, at least that in the United States, the expenditures are through the roof, and it's not just affecting patients, but also doctors. We've got severe doctor burnout. We've got also doctor shortages, which is a different problem,
Yes.
constantly a discussion. But there's a lot of hope in the things that you're saying in terms of not incremental changes, but fundamental shifts to how people approach disease over a longer term, and then also how treatment can be more personalized and specific and more deeply rooted in the newest knowledge on how it's actually evolving in your own body.
Yeah.
Can you kind of paint the picture where you think we're going to be in about 5 years? Like, what could happen with our overall healthcare, how the healthcare system might work so that it's patient-centric using these technologies, but also realistic with the context of what we have right now?
Yeah. So I'll get to that in a second. I'm going to make one comment. I want to take us to the past and then to the future. So I was driving up about a month ago to give a lecture at RPI, and I was listening to a book, and not a recent book. This book was written 2,000 years ago by Seneca the Younger, one of the Stoics. And I just got such a kick. So I'm going up. I'm going to give my talk on scientific wellness and all the advanced stuff that we've done. And I got to this. There are all these epistles. So there's just these. It's called the Moral Epistles, and it's just writings that he does to his protege of his. The thing that's amazing about it is how timely it is. I find it very interesting. So as I was listening to it, he starts talking about health advice and how these things should be dealt with. And he makes basically the argument that I do in the age of scientific wellness, which is he said, the key factor is that you want to extend your life and not your death. He said it way better than I ever did. And that is the point, which is we have to have a healthcare system, because so much of our healthcare, and one of the most brilliant books, recent book, Being Mortal by Atul Gawande, beautiful book, but it's about this, kind of incredible spending and elongation of the last worst parts of our life, of really extending our death, in the words of Seneca. And we want to extend life. So one is that when we talk about a paradigm change, that's really it. How do we extend our lives and not extend our deaths? So that's a big one. The second, just as a random aside, is he went on to give some health advice, and apparently the new fad in Rome at that point was periodic fasting. So
do you do intermittent fasting?
Of course.
Me too, especially when I have to travel on a plane.
It seems like a very good thing. But when he gave the advice for periodic fasting, I was in my car alone, so I just bust up laughing. I was like, wow. So the reason I gave that background is one thing I want to say is technologies really change, but what we want or desire as humans really doesn't, not much. And so that's what we want this extension of life. We want to be healthy. We want to have as much time with our loved ones as we can. And so, so that's really the backdrop I think of when we're talking about the revolution of medicine. Like, how do we better deliver what we actually want and have wanted for thousands and thousands of years? So as I look to the future, then I see a lot of hope, a lot of challenge. Because the system is very entrenched. It's a $4 trillion a year enterprise in the United States that doesn't turn on a dime by any means. But I do see a lot of optimism. So I think within the next 5 years, one is that the degree to which we can really personalize therapies and approaches, I think, is getting much, much better. And our ability to do forecasting, like what we talked about with digital twins and so forth, is much improved. And I think that's going to help us intervene a lot earlier, because to intervene earlier, you really have to have access to sufficient measurements, which we're now getting at much bigger scale, getting cheaper, better all the time. You've got to be able to make sense of those, which I think the digital twin technologies and other things like that are really helping us get. And then you have to be able to deliver information and solutions at scale. But now when you look, and we talked about the LLMs, that's the ability to deliver personalized information. That's going to get better incredibly fast. Tons of people in the world working on it. Being able to be in people's homes with telehealth, delivering, measurement devices, all the things that we need to be, highly personalized and proactive in this space, I think is here. We just have to pull them together and make them work, for people in the world. And so if we don't get in our own way, I think we're really looking at places where we can start to have big impact, not only in staving off disease, but slowing aging and just elongating our health span. And I think that's a very, real goal, and I'm excited about that future.
I also see one of the things changing is mindset. And your book with Dr. Leroy Hood is one in actually a series that have recently come out, Lifespan, Outlive. You have kind of medical celebrities like Peter Attia who have podcasts debating different lifestyle choices. Should you be in a hot sauna? Should you be in a wet sauna? As well as others. And I think it's putting, taking care of your health and owning your health more prominently in people's view, and also creating kind of a broader set of self-treatments that you can administer, not just vitamin D supplements, but other supplementation, not just running and jogging, but maybe strength training or maybe sauna. If you are extremely, not inclined to exercise, at least you can get some benefits from that too. And things like sleep becoming important again with Dr. Matthew Walker in his book. So I also see there's like a kind of a, I don't have the data on this, but I just feel like the content that's coming out is focused on helping people shift mindsets and take advantage.
There's a huge hunger for this kind of thing. I mean, you mentioned Peter Attia, who has one of the best podcasts out there. Andrew Huberman, really exploded onto the scene. I remember, meeting him because, Thorne sponsored that podcast in the early days. So Paul and I were on a call with him, and I remember he's a professor at Stanford. He's like, I'm going to start this podcast. It's going to be great. I remember thinking cool, you're starting a podcast, good luck, and then, a year later, especially with the book, please let me on your podcast. It's amazing, right? He's been insanely successful, kudos to him. He's been incredibly good at that. You mentioned the books that have really, moved the needle, Outlive, obviously, Peter's book, Lifespan, David Sinclair's book, which really brought aging to the forefront of people's minds in a big way. All of those kind of things, I think, just show how much hunger there is, because the dissatisfaction with the current healthcare system is massive. That's partly economic because people are scared to go to the doctor because they don't know what the economic impact is going to be to them. I know many people like that. I'm sure you do too. And there's this sense that, and I do think the healthcare system, if you're it's good at what it does, in the sense that, as a disease care system, it can be life-saving, and it's set up that way. But we need to expand and really build, what I call a scientific wellness system, or a preventive health system that is much more active, much deeper in terms of the amount of information and knowledge we have. And I don't think we were set up to do it really well until fairly recently, because we just now have all the tools. So the question is, how quickly can we build a system that really is oriented and built around expanding health span? There are groups that are positive towards this. For example, Deloitte, which is a big consulting firm, they build these forecasts of the future, and they came out with a report, which I was very much in favor of, that believes that healthcare will shift to be majority focused on this extension of health span and prevention by 2040. So they expect about a $2 trillion shift in that direction over the next little less than 20 years. So if we can actually achieve something like that, that would be a monumental shift and a monumental pace given the size of what we're talking about. So I would love to see that happen, and I'm going to do my best to do my little part in trying to make that happen as well.
Well, one of the things we haven't talked about is your role at the University of Virginia's Coulter Center.
Yes.
And so for listeners, the Coulter Center, one of the things that it does is it funds translational research, primarily in life sciences, biotechnology, so research that has potential to tremendously impact patients' lives and how we treat people. So I'm wondering what your goals are with that role and what you're here for that meeting. So
yes,
what are you hoping to accomplish? What are you looking forward to? And are you championing any specific technologies or research at the university?
Yeah, so I've really loved being on the board for the Coulter Translational Center, and it is a group where there's an endowment that's here at the university. And then we do spend off of that endowment to support projects for people that are trying to do translation. And so what this means for listeners that aren't familiar with that word is just how do you go from what you're learning in the lab and get it out so that it might be something that could be picked up by a company, or you spin out your own company, or however you're going to do that so you can get that treatment or diagnostic or whatever it is out there into the world. So for me, what I really enjoy is that I get to hear about some of the latest and greatest that's coming out from the researchers that are here at the University of Virginia. It's a lot of great ideas. We get into some good, robust discussions around, what's the best path forward and what works and what doesn't, and try to give advice on what we think will help it translate. Very friendly, very wonderful meetings, and I have tons of friends here at the University of Virginia, so it's fun for me as well. And so, yeah, what I really look to do is just try to, hopefully be as helpful as I can to those project areas. And hopefully over time we see some of these things really move out and make a difference in the world. And of course, that's a big part of the University of Virginia's mission. And hope, again, to do my small part to help that happen.
Are there any projects that you've seen that you're really passionate about or dip your fingers in, maybe beyond the role of the board, just because of your personal interest in what's going on with those?
Yeah, well, one project that I do find really fascinating, and I have, evangelized it out, and I'll, to the extent I can. The board meetings are confidential, so I have not talked about stuff in the board meeting, but some of it, once it gets published, I talk about it just for the record. But one study that I really like is from Jason Papin, who's also a good friend of mine. But he has a study that's a really different take. So there's a disease-causing bacteria pathogen called C. difficile. It's one of the worst pathogens that you get in hospitals, and it causes all kinds of problems, very painful. It's nasty. You don't want to get it. So one of the things is, though, that a lot of people have it in their guts and don't get sick, right? So some people do, some people don't. And the reason for this is that the big problem is that this bacteria will secrete a toxin. And it's the toxin the bacteria itself isn't the problem, it's that it secretes this toxin. And so what people have tried to do a lot is, how do you kill C. diff, right? Get rid of it. Get rid of it. That's the standard approach, like we'd think of. So what the Papin group did, or what Jason did, which was really innovative, is to figure out why is it that this bacteria secretes a toxin. And so under this model, the problem is that it has other enemies in the microbiome. And these enemies, and so it gets under stress, or it's doing it, so it secretes the toxin. So it's basically undertaking bacterial warfare. It doesn't even know about you. It doesn't care about you, right? So it's it's a warfare, and you're just collateral damage. You just happen to be there, and it ends up being horrible for you. And so what Jason's group has been focusing on is, how do you make the microbiome more hospitable, a happier place for C. diff, or the short name for this, C. difficile or C. diff. How do you get C. diff to be happy so that it doesn't engage in warfare, which is the problem, because it's sitting there as not. So instead of trying to kill it, you could actually take this totally different approach of, let's don't set it off. And so I like that a lot, because it's very sort of counterintuitive to the way we usually think about these things. And it gives you a very different path into thinking about how to deal with some of these disease cases. And especially in the microbiome, because when I was growing up, it was all antibiotics. Right? You take antibiotics and you just kill germs, right? I feel like that was all TV commercials, right? Spray the kill germs, and that's kind of the level. But then you find out that you don't really want to do that, because if you decimate the microbiome in your mouth or on your skin or in your gut, your microbiome is a part of your defense against incoming pathogens, because you already have all these good bacteria there, and so it's hard for the disease causing to get in. But if you decimate them, and they do. So this is a more holistic kind of systems approach to dealing with this, which is, and I think that it's probably one of a whole class of problems that might be like that, especially in the microbiome arena, where it's not only about going in and killing the bad actor or killing a lot of things off at the same time. You might be able to nudge these systems in ways that are easier to deal with. So anyway, they're looking at ways to get that more developed. But I find that to be a really interesting notion.
Yeah, that's a really cool concept. Is that something where your digital twins research can also be of assistance in terms of?
In the long run, potentially. I mean, right now, I'm not sure how to connect those up. There are a lot of connections that are emerging, though, between the microbiome and Alzheimer's disease. So I do serve on another board that's across Duke, Caltech, and UCSD that's actually studying this whole area of the gut-brain axis, and particularly Alzheimer's and the connections to the microbiome. We don't have a lot that's super concrete yet, other than we can find associations that are in the microbiome. We know that a lot of the neurotransmitters that are that for your brain are made in the microbiome. There are signals from the microbiome that get into the brain. I did co-led a study with Rima Kadura-Dauk at Duke that showed that bile acids that apparently are made in the microbiome appear in the brains of patients that have Alzheimer's disease. It was a first study. I want to get further down that road, but that's what it looked like. And so there are these emerging relationships. So as we get better at that, we can do it. Oh, and another molecule, phosphatidylcholine, which turns out to be useful for the brain, becomes rate limiting under these low oxygen conditions for a lot of people. You can take that as a supplement, or you can just eat. If you eat eggs is a really common dietary source for it. So we think that's important for the brain. But again, the microbiome comes in, because if you have certain bacteria in your microbiome, they will eat phosphatidylcholine, and they will turn it into something called trimethylamine. Well, when trimethylamine gets in your blood, your liver turns it into TMAO, which is a risk factor for cardiovascular disease. So you could literally be trying to improve the health of your brain and instead hurt your heart. And so there's all kinds of connections like this that are, only starting to be understood. But the microbiome is going to be an incredibly rich area for us to learn from going forward. So the more you get into these details, it becomes fascinating. But the other point I'll make is, if you're listening to this, it probably starts sounding overwhelming, right? Because there's so much complexity to remember and things to do. For me too. Yeah, like it's a lot. And so what we have to do is to build this all into the algorithm so that we make it as simple and easy as possible for people to implement. So we have to deal with this complexity, but it has to come on the side of the systems that we create, because you're just never going to remember, it's too much to have your mind wrapped around all the time. You got to live your life. But if we can build these things and automate them and make it easier and easier, we should be able to really optimize people's health in a massive way.
Well, the future of health that you paint is exciting. And I think there's a lot of pieces that are coming together that show that this is a possible future and we can keep going down it. And obviously the work of both your research, your commercial work, but also the writing and the Age of Scientific Wellness are there to try to help us get to that future. So I'm so glad we got to chat today. Thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thanks so much, Sasha. Great to be with you.
Thank you for listening to Biomedical Frontiers, Stories with Innovators in Healthcare. My name is David Chen, and I am the Managing Director of the Wallace H. Coulter Center for Translational Research at the University of Virginia. Our mission is to help bring promising new biomedical research and technology into the hands of the provider and the patient. If you found this episode valuable, please let us know by subscribing, following, or sharing. You can learn more about our promising translational research projects on our website. See links in the show notes.